What is historical fiction? How has it changed over the past 200 years? Can you really learn history by reading it? And what are some of the unsung classics of the genre you should know about? Over the next few months, I'll be exploring the evolution of the historical fiction genre here on my channel and on my Substack. This has been a long-term, multi-decade project for me, similar to what I did last year covering the history of apocalyptic fiction, only much bigger. I've read hundreds of historical fiction novels spanning every publishing era and type of story. It's one of my favorite genres. In a series of videos and essays, I plan to examine historical fiction through a variety of lenses, including the competing social and political purposes the genre has served, as well as the tension between history and fiction inherent in the genre's name. I'll look at the conscious and unconscious biases of historical fiction authors, at their tendencies to focus on major historical events, conflicts, and people, rather than on simple everyday life in the past, and at the decisions they make to sanitize and mythologize history, or to present it as it actually happened, including the unflattering parts. I'll cover the genre creep that's blurred the boundaries of historical fiction in recent decades, leading to substantial overlap with the mystery, romance, and fantasy genres, among others. I'll also spotlight specific authors and types of historical novels and provide reading suggestions that go far beyond the relatively small handful of well-known novels that tend to receive the lion's share of popular attention. The genre has far more to offer than the highly regarded works of Larry McMurtry, James Clavell, Hilary Mantel, Ken Follett, Kristen Hanna, Bernard Cornwell, and Anthony Doerr, among others. This video is a preview, a sneak peek of what's to come. I'm just scratching the surface here. Welcome to the Library Ladder. Before jumping into a discussion of historical fiction, a useful starting point is to define what the term means. It's not as easy as it might seem. Whose perspective defines what's historical? How far back in time from that perspective does the story need to be set? And should different standards apply to hybrid historical works that cross over into other genres? Or do we just know it when we see it? There's no expert consensus on any of those questions. Some say historical fiction should be defined by when the author wrote it. Is the story set in a time period the author perceived as history? Others define it in terms of the reader's perspective. How far removed from the reader's time period is a novel set? The author-centered approach yields stable and objective categorization, while the reader-centered one is subjective and fluid, constantly changing over time as new generations of readers encounter a work. Also, an author's conception of their work as contemporary fiction or historical fiction can affect their writing. The best-known works of Jane Austen, Eric Maria Remarque, Daphne du Maurier, and John le Carré were contemporary fiction when they were written, not historical fiction. They weren't reconstructing a distant past. They were writing about their present day, or the very recent past in the case of Remarque's World War I novel. They were writing for readers already familiar with the novel's time periods, so it wasn't essential for them to include a lot of background information, explanations, and descriptive details to establish their settings. It probably didn't even occur to them that their books would still be read decades, or in some cases centuries later, by audiences with very different life experiences and perspectives. As novelist L.P. Hartley put it in the opening of his 1953 novel, The Go-Between, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." Thus, when later authors tackled those same time periods with historical fiction, typically neither they nor their readers had first-hand knowledge of the subject matter. They hadn't experienced it themselves. Those authors often put extra effort into describing the setting, the plot setup, and minor period details to aid reader comprehension and to make the story feel more immersive. Consider Georgette Heyer, whose historical romance novels set in the late 18th and early 19th centuries were directly inspired by the works of Jane Austen. But Heyer wrote hers more than a century later and felt it was important to include, for the benefit of 20th century readers, detailed descriptions of settings, social customs, and clothing that Austen likely assumed her readers already knew. Heyer performed exhaustive research to make the period details in her stories accurate, and she assembled a large personal reference library of antiquarian books, correspondence, and artwork from the time period she wrote about. Unfortunately, her commitment to accuracy is an outlier. Many, if not most, fiction authors who write about the past seem content simply to create a vibe that feels historical but lacks substance, frequently relying not on primary sources for their research, but on second and third-hand accounts, often fictional, that filter, interpret, and distort history, placing more distance between it and the reader. Further complicating matters, there's disagreement among the experts about how far in the past a novel's setting should be to qualify as historical. Some think a long look-back period, perhaps 50 or even 100 years, is most appropriate to create clear separation between the author, or the reader, and the time period covered by the work. Others say a novel simply needs a setting that predates the author's or reader's lived experience to avoid overlap with their own memories of the time period. This approach results in variable and wide-ranging look-back periods depending on the author's or reader's age. And then there are those who believe perceptions of what's historical tend to follow a generational cycle. For them, a story set at least a generation before it was written or read is sufficient to make it historical. There are reasonable arguments in support of each of those definitions. However, for the sake of clarity, consistency, comparability, and the potential for greater fidelity to history among the novels I'll be discussing, I've opted to define the historical fiction genre based on the author's perspective and not the reader's, and looking back at least a generation, or roughly 25 years, from the novel's publication date. That definition doesn't solve all of the classification problems with the genre, but it makes it a lot more manageable while still casting a wide net. I'll also note that my definition of historical fiction isn't the one the website Goodreads uses to categorize books. Goodreads' definition tends to be based on the reader's perspective rather than the author's, although it's not always consistent with that approach. One final caveat is that I'm not attempting to track the history and evolution of historical fiction around the world. I'm limiting myself to English-language fiction and to classics translated from other languages that influenced later works in English. So, moving on to the substance of my historical fiction project, what are some of the topics and questions I'll be tackling in this series of videos and essays? I plan to look at the early roots of historical fiction and its origins as a protest against the Industrial Revolution, offering romantic, adventurous heroes as an antidote or escape from the bean counters, engineers, technocrats, and rapacious toadies who were transforming the world in the early 1800s. I'll also explore the important role the genre played in furthering universal education for children throughout much of the 19th century. Historical fiction became an essential and enjoyable complement to the dry and often scarce history textbooks of the day. By the late 1800s, the genre was co-opted by literary realists, satirists, and political propagandists for their own purposes. It also became a mainstay of the early pulp fiction magazines, and elements of the fantastical also began to appear in its stories as precursors to the modern fantasy genre. By the 1920s, though, historical fiction was mired in mediocrity and mendacity and desperately needed rescuing, a feat eventually accomplished through the separate efforts of a respected poet, a teenage girl, and Hollywood, leading to an almost 40-year renaissance for the genre from the 1930s to the 1960s. One of my upcoming videos will focus on what made that mid-century period so pivotal for the genre. And as its popularity increased, the genre became more fragmented and fraught with competing priorities and objectives. Historical faithfulness, always a point of contention in the genre, became even more tenuous as authors, given a choice between history and legend, found it more profitable and entertaining to promote the legends and to create new legends. Religious convictions introduced another kind of faithfulness, as authors used the genre to proselytize their beliefs. Novels about ancient Rome provide plenty of examples of both of those types of biases, dating back to the earliest days of the genre and continuing today. I've read dozens of novels about that time period, and it's remarkable how little agreement there is among them. They're a perfect example of how the genre struggles to balance history with fiction. I'll be making a video about Roman historical fiction and the hazards of trying to learn history from it, due to the many inconsistencies, fabrications, and acts of creative license to be found in the novels. Was Julius Caesar the savior of Rome, or its destroyer? Was Augustus a compassionate and visionary leader, or a paranoid backstabber with a cruel streak? Was Claudius a deeply intelligent and savvy emperor, or a half-witted imbecile? Was the great lawyer and orator Cicero an idealistic social justice warrior, a proto-libertarian tool of the elites, or merely a power-hungry and opportunistic social climber? And who really was Boudica, or Mark Antony, or Cleopatra? You might develop a false sense of confidence, but you'll never truly learn the answers from reading novels about those historical figures. Understanding history gets even more complicated with the recent trend of authors inverting the hero and villain relationships in their stories, presenting sympathetic versions of Nero, Circe, and Medusa, among others, making them the misunderstood heroes of their stories. I also plan to explore various types of historical fiction and works covering different time periods and geographies. Expansive family sagas have cycled in and out of popularity over the past century and a half, often extolling or critiquing points of view about society's class structure, the immigrant experience, capitalism, and traditional cultural norms and values. There are narratives about the medieval era from the perspectives of Celts, Vikings, Saxons, Normans, and their descendants. And Ken Follett isn't the only one who wrote noteworthy novels about the construction of a Gothic church. There's no shortage of stories about the Tudor era of British history, while I think the Stuart period deserves more interest from authors. Prominent points in American history are also well represented, including the colonial and antebellum periods, the Civil War and its aftermath, and westward expansion. Nautical adventure stories are some of my favorites, and I'll be discussing a wide range of them, along with their close cousin, military fiction. War has long been a preferred subject for historical fiction writers, perhaps rivaled only by love stories. And speaking of love, I'll trace the evolution of historical romance novels, from enjoyable early 20th century works inspired by Jane Austen and the Brontes, to the many mid-century imitators they spawned, and the decadent spiral to the Fabio artwork era and sexy historical thrillers of the 1980s and 90s. Geographically, I'll cover the globe, from ancient Egypt, Greece, and other parts of the Levant, to France, Italy, Ireland, Russia, China, Australia, the Caribbean, the South Seas, South Africa, and Central and Southern Asia, just to name a few places. Finally, I'll conclude this large undertaking with a look at how the historical fiction genre has expanded into other genres, both for adults and for children. In contrast to its early days when it was dominated by heroic adventure fiction, many of the most popular historical works of the past 40 years have been marketed primarily as literary, mystery, thriller, fantasy, and romance novels, further blurring the popular conception of historical fiction and, paradoxically, making it both more popular and less popular than it's ever been. It makes me wonder what's prompting so many authors in those other genres to focus on the distant past. Is our world too dull, too complex, too enlightened, or too interconnected for the kinds of stories authors want to tell or readers want to read? Are authors opting to use the past as a surrogate to tell allegorical stories about the present? And is it even possible to write a compelling whodunit these days without setting it in a remote time period or location where human sleuthing takes precedence over technology-centered investigation? It's going to take me several months to cover in depth the topics I've just highlighted. Much of it will be here on my channel, but some of the smaller or more niche discussions will probably appear only on my Substack, which I've linked in the video description below. I hope you're as excited about this project as I am. I've been working on it for a very long time. Thanks for watching.